Hi, Mary. Welcome to One Woman's Journey. Thanks so much for joining us today. So it would be great if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself. That would be great.
Thanks, Rachel. It's really nice to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
You're welcome.
I currently work as a business coach. I help coaches and solopreneurs simplify their businesses so they can have more of an impact and more income without feeling like they're spreading themselves too thin.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also an author. I've self-published several books on Amazon on all different kinds of topics, nonfiction, mostly in the self-help genre, everything
Mm-hmm.
from stress relief to how to price your offerings. And then I also have a memoir on there as well.
Mm-hmm. And a money book, I know you have, because I read that one and it was really helpful.
Cool. Yeah. I have a book called Let's Make Money, Honey.
Yeah, exactly.
That a lot of people seem to like.
Yeah.
So thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate it. It was a fun one to write, I have to say.
Yeah.
To
And
sure.
to read. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So how did things start out for you, Mary, on your journey?
It's really interesting because I had a pretty fine childhood. My family situation is a bit unusual in that I came along very late in the family.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was born, my sister was 19 and my brother was 16. And we have the same parents. So my sister was already out of the house in college. My brother was obviously still living at home. And so that was a bit of an unusual start. And I never lived with my sister. So that's kind of odd to most people. And my brother got married when I was quite young. My sister got married when I was 2. My brother got married when I was 7. I was an aunt by the time I was 8, so that whole dynamic is a bit weird. Also, I never had any grandparents. All my grandparents died way, way, way before I was born because I came along late and they all died very young. They were, I don't even think any of them reached 60. So my family structure is a bit unusual in that way. My brother and sister are still living. They're in their 70s. I'm in my late 50s.
Wow.
My parents are not. My mom died quite a long time ago when I was 30, and my dad died when he was 90. So he lived quite a long time, which was cool. And I also moved around a lot when I was young. So I moved states a few times and had, in that sense, I think that was really the only thing about my childhood that I would say was a bit challenging, was just moving from place to place. And just trying to adapt to a new school. It was always in the middle of the school year. We never moved in the summer. It was always in the middle of the school year. So, so that was a bit challenging, but, other than that, my childhood was pretty great. Honestly, I lived in really nice places and was never wanting for anything. And, even though the age gap was pretty large between me and my siblings, I was very close to them. Even when we weren't living in the same state, we saw each other frequently. We traveled to see them. They traveled to see me. My sister in particular was incredibly involved in my life growing up. And she didn't have a daughter of her own until she was a little bit older. I think I was maybe 13 or something. So she had a lot of energy to give to me until that point, which was kind of cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So where did you go in terms of employment or education when you became an adult?
Mm-hmm. So when I graduated from high school, I went to UCLA in Los Angeles, and I got a bachelor's degree in music.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really unsure what to do with that degree. I was actually I was considering going on to become a music historian, because that was sort of my forte, I discovered while I was in school. And I also was a really good writer. So that was another piece. I thought maybe I could bring those two things together.
Mm.
But that isn't what happened. What actually happened was I ended up getting married right out of college. I was quite young. I was 22 and he was 25. And unfortunately, that marriage was abusive from day one, something that I did not expect. I had really even looking back on it, there was really no warning that that was what was going to occur
Mm-hmm.
in that relationship. I remember seeing his temper flare just once in all the time that I knew him, and certainly nothing that would have led me to think he would, do anything towards me.
Mm.
And yet there I was suddenly in an abusive marriage. And, as you might imagine, from what I told you, I didn't have any experience with anything like that. My parents never argued. We never had any violence in the home, or not even any swearing. Nobody in my house even drank alcohol. So, it was a very kind of, I don't know, it was an uneventful childhood in that way. I'd never been around violence or anything like that. And so it really was a shock. I went into shock, essentially. And I feel like in many ways I lived in shock for the entire duration of the marriage, which was almost 7 years. I was in that relationship before I felt like I could leave without potentially being killed. And it just escalated from day one. It just got worse and worse and worse. I eventually had my daughter 5 years into the marriage. And a couple of years after that, I was able to leave in relative safety. I say that because it's incredibly dangerous for women in particular to leave abusive relationships. And I just had to make a judgment as best I could around when the timing could be, the most fortuitous for me and for my daughter, who was 2 at the time. So that's what happened to me after I graduated. I had a great time in college, and then that sort of set off my adult life at age 22 on a very different course from what I anticipated it would be.
So as you said, that was shocking to where you'd always been in your life, and then suddenly to come to find yourself in that position. What sort of thoughts did you have around that situation or about yourself?
It was a very confusing time. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't ever label it as domestic violence until after I left. I didn't understand what was going on, to be candid. And I know that sounds kind of crazy because I am and was an intelligent person, but it just was so outside of my normal experience that I didn't know how to classify it. I just didn't understand. And so I spent, that whole period basically trying to figure out how to not die. That was my all-consuming thought. How can I set this up on a daily and moment by moment basis so that he will not do something horrible? And I didn't succeed most of the time. I succeeded in not dying, but I couldn't stop him from doing whatever he was going to do, but I thought that I could. I kept trying different things and trying to just, mold myself into any shape I needed to, essentially, to try to stem the tide of violent behavior and words and everything else. And I couldn't. And, it's really a strange thing to try to explain to people because it seems so obvious. Oh, well, if somebody does something violent towards you, obviously they don't care. Well, it's not so easy when that person has just stood up in front of 100 people and said they love you, and they are, take your hand in marriage, and then that very day the violence begins. It's like, wait, what?
Wow.
So yeah, it was so that's really what my all-consuming thought was. The abuse was less while I was pregnant with my daughter, but shortly after she was born, it started up again. And then I decided in some weird way that I wanted to have another child, because I thought, well, maybe, he'll stop again. And unfortunately, when I got pregnant, the violence got worse. Wow. And I ended up having a miscarriage, I think in large part because of what was going on physically at that time. And so it wasn't long after that miscarriage that I left. I think it was maybe, I want to say, about a month after that I decided it was time to go for various reasons. But the timing seemed right.
And did you carry that impact with you into the coming years?
Yeah, I still lived in that state of mind for many, many years after that. Unfortunately, the abuse I discovered was not limited to me. He had been abusing our daughter as well.
Wow.
And I discovered that when she was a toddler, did everything I could to prevent it going forward after I was divorced, couldn't stop it. And finally, several years later, a judge agreed with what we were saying. But by that point, I was like 40, 41. So I've been dealing with him for 20 years. Wow. And, it's a long time to be dealing with an abusive person like that, even after the divorce. It was like another 11 years post-divorce that I was still dealing with him. And I really didn't have much of a sense of living during that time. I saw a lot of therapists starting literally while I was married, thinking there was something wrong with me. I don't know how many therapists I saw when I was married to him. I don't know, maybe 7 or 8, something like that in the 7 years. And then I saw several after that, and still just never really had a sense that, I was able to live without fearing for my safety and all those kinds of things. I eventually did get remarried. When my daughter was 9, I got remarried, and I'm still married to him, over 20 years now. And even in the context of that relationship, I was still living a lot of the time in that state of high alert. I wouldn't call it anxiety. It's more like high alert. It's just being very aware of your surroundings, and, you're kind of on guard 24/7. And it's also a very frustrating state of mind, because you can see other people walking around not in that state, and you don't know how to get there. I think that was even worse, was I was really consumed with jealousy of people who, in my opinion, had normal life experiences and normal relationships. And I was insanely jealous and didn't have a clue how to have that for myself.
Did that send you on a search to find something that would change that for you?
In a way, I kept looking for new ideas around post-traumatic stress disorder, and saw a couple of therapists in particular that I'm remembering who specialized in that. I tried some alternative kinds of self-help things, and nothing was really working. I'd feel better for a little while, and then I would just kind of go back to the way that I'd always felt. And it seemed to me that the person that I had been before I got married, who had that nice childhood and all that, that she was gone. Like there was no getting back to that. And that somehow I was just going to have to live with this, you know? And I was angry about that.
Yeah.
So I walked around with a lot of anger and jealousy, and I was angry at my ex-husband, and, you know, had a lot of vengeful type thinking about him. And, you know, just was really not in a very good place most of the time. It's not to say I never felt happy. I did at times, but it was really fleeting, really fleeting.
It sounds like you were carrying that and living with what had happened previously. You're still carrying and living that every day.
I was, yes.
Yeah.
Definitely was.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I know things got better for you.
Yeah, they did. Eventually, yes.
Yeah.
Eventually.
So perhaps you'd like to tell us about how you know, how things improved.
I think it was in 2011 and 12. I had been seeing by all accounts, a good PTSD therapist. She specialized in working with women like myself. And she said this really weird thing to me one time that I didn't understand. But she said, you know, I've worked with a lot of women, and I've worked with a lot of women who, by all accounts, had less of an abusive situation than you've had on many levels. And she said, you know, I don't really understand what's going on, because most of them have ended up as alcoholics or drug addicts, or they commit suicide, or they just, you know, can't get it together. And she said, but if I look at your life, you've done just fine, you know, in terms of those kinds of things. I got 2 graduate degrees. I had good jobs. I raised my daughter, who's doing really well. I got remarried, and, you know, my relationships in general were good. And she was like, I don't really understand what it is about you that's, you know, been able to do that. And I remember thinking, is that a compliment? I'm not really sure how to take that. It sounded really funny.
Yeah.
And so after I finished that program with her, which was about 1.5 years, I was doing okay for about a year. And then in like late 2013, early 2014, I started to feel that downhill slide again. And I got really mad. I was like, okay, I've done everything I can possibly think of to do, everything. And yet here I am again. What the heck? You know, this just doesn't seem fair. And I wouldn't say that I gave up, but I kind of did. Kind of did. I wasn't looking anymore for anything. And I was like, well, you know, I guess this is it. This is the best I can do. And so I think it was the summer of 2014, I ran across a book totally by accident, because as I said, I wasn't looking for anything, called The Inside Out Revolution by Michael Neill. I'd never heard of Michael Neill. I didn't know anything about him. And I saw someone online talking about this book, and she wasn't really saying all that much about what was in the book. She just said it was really life-changing. And I thought, well, I've pretty much done everything else. I might as well read this book, right? What's one more thing? So I bought the book, and I had a fairly long commute to work. I was living in New York City at the time and took the subway to and from work. So I got the Audible version, and I was listening to it on my commute. And the first time I heard it, I really didn't know what to make of it. It didn't really sound, I don't know how to put it. It didn't quite make sense to me, what he was saying, but I could tell there was something different in it. I just couldn't pinpoint what it was. So being the kind of person that I am, I was like, well, I'm going to listen to it again then, because I kind of want to figure this out. What is he saying? So I listened to it, I think like 4 or 5 times in a row, because every time I listened to it, I was like, okay, I'm starting to get closer to understanding what he's trying to convey here. So maybe the next time I'll get it, you know? So like the 4th or 5th time through, I finally heard what he was actually saying. And to sum it up basically in a sentence, was that there was actually nothing wrong with me at all. You know, all of the time that I had been dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder from the time I got married until that period of time, I had been seeing myself, and of course this was reinforced by my ex-husband and all the therapists I saw, I'd been seeing myself as completely messed up, you know, broken, like not fixable, essentially. And what I heard from Michael in the book was totally different from that, which was that actually there was nothing broken about me, that the only thing that was happening was what happens to every other human being, which is that we have thoughts that create an experience for us. And the thoughts that I had at the time, I don't even want to call them mine, because they were thoughts going through my mind at the time, were a certain tone. And so that's what my experience looked like for me. And once I realized, and I remember this so clearly, I was sitting on the subway and I was like, oh, okay, so I'm having certain kinds of thoughts right now about being uncomfortable being around all these people. But that person across from me is in the same exact environment that I'm in, and they're sitting there looking completely calm. So clearly this thought thing is where it's at, because we're all having our own experience, even though we're all sitting here in the subway car together. And that was a huge relief. Like, to say that that was life-changing would be putting it mildly. I suddenly realized, oh, okay, well, everyone has thinking. So it's no big deal. Whatever thoughts come through and whatever feelings come with it, so what? So I just would sit with that. If I would be on the subway and I'd feel uncomfortable, I would just sit there and not make like a big deal out of it, because I was like, oh, it's passing thought. It's giving me an experience right now, but there's nothing intrinsically wrong with me because I'm having this, so I'll just sit here. And honestly, I think it took about 5 or 6 weeks of kind of playing with that and experimenting with that. And I'd say about 95% of my PTSD symptoms just faded away.
Wow.
You know, I still occasionally have little bits of it, but I just don't care now. You know, it's just like, oh, well, yeah, I recognize that thought going by. That's whatever.
Yeah.
I just don't worry about it.
Yeah. So it really had a massive impact on your life. Just understanding that actually we're just all feeling our thinking in the moment, and actually that, you know, those thoughts come and they go again.
Yeah.
So what did you do? How did it impact your life when you found this understanding and started to move forward?
Well, nothing really happened at the beginning, except for the fact that I was experiencing things completely differently. You know, so nothing kind of circumstantially changed right away. About a year later, I left my job that I had been in that I really didn't like and went to work for another company. And then that only lasted about 6 months. I think, and then I started working for myself. But I think, you know, one of the things I did was I started talking to other people about this. That was about the only thing that really changed in what I was doing. So I was sharing it with my friends and my family, whoever wanted to listen. You know, I started a little group on Facebook about it, and just very casually. So when I ended up losing the job that I took after my long-term one, I thought, well, I guess maybe I'll just coach people in this, you know, I'll put up a shingle and say that this is what I'm doing. So that's what I did. I didn't intend to do that. It just was like, well, this seems like a logical next thing to do. So let's try it.
Yeah.
And see what happens.
Yeah.
So that was in 2016.
Okay. And was that the start of maryschiller.com?
Yeah, I actually had a different website at the time. I'd been just on a personal level, I had been exploring all of this, and I had been doing a daily audio blog. So I was posting that. So it was originally that, and then I moved it over to maryschiller.com.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, so I coached people around all of this for about a year and a half, 2 years. And then I eventually started moving into the business realm because I had a lot of experience in that myself before, and also seemed to be able to help people to get their coaching businesses kind of off to a better start.
Mm.
So I really had fun with that and found it really creative. So, but the thing is everything that I do is now infused with seeing life from this angle.
Mm.
So even though I'm a business coach, it's still always underneath the surface, this way of seeing people as being whole and healthy and not broken, and having, everything that they need, and all of their creative sparkle and all of that is just, at the ready. And I enjoy exploring that in a business context now.
Yeah. So just seeing life, how life works, and seeing it in a different way is so freeing, isn't it? And you're able really to follow your dreams, I guess, and you create, and just seeing life differently makes so much difference to us, doesn't it?
It does. I think one thing I would say is going back to what the therapist said to me about, how I had been able to do all of these things anyway. What that showed me was that whether I ever saw life this way or not really didn't matter, because things were still being created through me. Relationships and wonderful things like that were still happening, even though on sort of a conscious level, I wasn't really with it. Like I was living in this weird zone, but on a much deeper level, and what I see is what we truly are made of, things were still happening and being created. So now I don't necessarily know for sure that all of these things wouldn't have happened anyway. I'm just aware now. I'm just more consciously aware of the truth, I guess I would say. I'm not living in that very tense place anymore. So
yeah. Mary, I want to thank you for sharing so openly today.
You're welcome.
I'm sure it will help a lot of the women that are following one woman's journey. And if we just finish off, let people know what you're up to right now.
Yeah, I recently started a new group for women in business called the Bold Women Mastermind. And the focus of that is really about kind of what you and I have been talking about in a way, about women who are able to see themselves in a different way, and who want to create something, to a vehicle for earning money that is fun. I hesitate to say business all the time because it sounds so boring. It's not boring at all, really. It's very creative and fun. It's really fun, right? That's kind of one of my mottos. Business is fun. And so that's one of the things that I'm doing right now. I'm just getting that off the ground as we're talking. So I'm hoping that grows and into something really exciting.
That's amazing, Mary. Thanks so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.